and have a listen through to other things. As you just heard, I started recording. And yeah, so if we just a couple of housekeeping, the chat is open, so you're very welcome to use it, but we do ask that you refer to the Q&A specifically if you want to ask the questions. It just means that it's all in one place and it makes it easier for to get to those questions and get back to you. So please do use the Q&A. You can submit questions anonymously if that's what you prefer to do as well. So by all means, use that functionality. So yeah, without more of ado, I will introduce our first speaker, Son, who's going to give us a bit of a speech about his own experiences as a migrant private renter.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tilly. So I do work at POMOC, but I guess, want to begin with my own experience. And like just before I sat down, I was thinking about both experiences in the Czech Republic. So my family moved there when I was 2 as Vietnamese migrants. I grew up there most of my life, very much renting, so moving between rented flats. And I moved to the UK when I was about 16. Like both have the two countries have different legal systems and perhaps different ways that legal rights are conferred on migrants and what these rights might be. But I guess I wanted to, at the time, I obviously didn't have any sense of rights under law. So I'm more kind of talking about the experience of discrimination itself, kind of at the relational level between the landlord and us. And like it's more of a kind of story about how Vietnamese people live, but many of us at least have a kind of a shrine that we have in our living rooms, shrine to our grandparents, to the ones that we've lost. And you burn incense that leave kind of like brownish stains on the wall. And this was a known fact about Vietnamese people. And it was also and therefore became a known reason why Vietnamese people struggled to find properties in the Czech Republic, because private landlords didn't really want to leave flats to a community that they thought would leave these brown stains on the ceiling. And I think these cultural assumptions, some of them are true, but kind of that's besides the point, are operative in the rental market itself, right? So it is from the kind of idea of the stories of kids from Asian, so Bangladeshi Indian families in the UK that are mocked racially for smelling like food. So too are there assumptions around people living in houses and cooking food that makes those properties around them smell. That those become then reasons. In the kind of market where landlords can essentially choose their tenants because there are so few properties for so many people, any reason, stated or not, becomes a way to exclude. So that is kind of one of the ways that discrimination is experienced at this relational level. The other thing that I kind of wanted to reflect on maybe is, so this is now kind of moving more towards and this is now I've moved to the UK, so has my uncle's family. And at the time when they first moved to the UK, I didn't have anywhere to stay, so I came to visit them. They had just moved to the country about 3 months ago, and they had no credit history, no friends that could be guarantors, nor did they have stable jobs that were stable enough to make them pass the credit checks that many landlords that perhaps own slightly nicer properties or just, that properties that would require. So that meant essentially for my uncle that they ended up in overcrowded, very much not habitable property that was owned by a migrant landlord, but was made possible, or the conditions of it were made possible because, or to be specific, he could rent out his property at such a terrible condition because there was no other option for new migrants like my uncle, right? For people that can't pass the normal credit checks that a landlord might do, that do not have a friend in the UK that can be their guarantor. I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that, like, in the many ways that the system works, so I can think Sam will talk about it. So, for example, not having the right to rent, or this credit check system, or just discrimination in general, migrant families or migrants are pushed into even worse accommodation, those that landlords are willing to provide at perhaps lower rents or higher rents, often unlawfully, whether that's unlawfully in the sense that, like, technically a landlord is not allowed to rent to someone without a right to rent, or unlawfully in the sense that it's overcrowded and is in a condition that would not be lawful in terms of, like, housing law. I might be chatting completely, you know, I'm not a law specialist, but not in the immigration sense, but in the housing sense, unlawful. And I suppose, like, so this is more the legal thing. And then finally, this is now me at the age of 24, having, or not, no, actually, I'm 26, having to move around and navigate the London housing market. And again, I'm kind of thinking about the way that this market now discriminates. And this is like, this is unverifiable claims, right? But I don't know if people on this call have tried to rent in London, but at least 2 years ago when I was looking, it was essentially queues and queues and queues and queues of people. And this is, again, I suppose, like, again, returning to the point of discrimination that I made at the very beginning. But now this is more like a kind of the effect on me as a person and, like, feelings is every time I was denied a property, it made me wonder whether one of the reasons why I was denied property was a form of racism. I cannot claim that it is true, but I think the way that we as migrants, especially racialized migrants, experience racism day to day becomes a kind of permanent feature, at least in many people's way of thinking, in kind of assuming that particular instances, negative instances that happen in our life can only be explained or are partly explained by racism. And, you know, I can't prove that, but this is kind of like, I think I'm trying to reflect on the way that, like, I move through a system that I know is racist, whether that's because I see police violence and I see kind of inequalities within racial communities, and how I take those things that I know to be politically true to also be true in the personal interactions that I have with landlords or real estate agents. And I think navigating that kind of market and constantly wondering whether it's being racist or discriminatory at the moment is draining. Again, nothing to do with rights, because I can't tell, you know, the landlord never says that it's because I'm XYZ, and it would be difficult to prove that it's because of these things. But it's just, to me, here a comment on discrimination. And I think the very final thing I'm kind of running between points, but the very final thing that I wanted to talk about was that, like, story of my uncle renting from a migrant landlord in a truly, truly, truly awful house. And what I wanted to kind of tease out there is that the way that the relationship between the structural relationship between the landlord as a property owner, as someone that has control over essentially my uncle's family, I think it is just a reflection that the way that that immigration law and housing law and the housing market works is to fragment the kind of potential community experience within migrant communities itself, right? It's to construct some of us as landlords and some of us as tenants, although we live in a fairly close community. So my uncle would have found that house through a friend. It fractured the community itself because it gave that landlord so much power over my uncle. It was also a power, the way that he experiences too, is that, like, he wouldn't want to complain in case that would affect his immigration status, rightly or wrongly, you know, you generally wouldn't. But it is, I think, something worth saying that, like, these relationships of power between owners of property to tenants that are vulnerable, whether it's because of immigration law, the market, or for whatever reason, make the building and connecting between people extremely difficult, and make a kind of like a genuinely stronger Vietnamese migrant community here in London was way more difficult to find. Yeah. And then maybe the very tiny last thing I want to say is this is now observation from my work at POMOC and in housing organizing in general. But I guess Sam will speak about rights, but I wanted to reflect on the possibility of enforcing these rights as a migrant, as someone that's perpetually worried about their ability to remain in the country. And many of the conversations that I've had with people have been around the fact that they know that they should be able to get more and that their rights are being violated. But there was a genuine worry that any form of, sticking their head out and complaining would affect their ability to first live in the country, but also live in the property, but also just to live in the country itself. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Sam. I really do appreciate these are hard to talk on. So thank you for being so honest and open about your experiences. Yeah, it is pretty horrendous, and I do appreciate that. I'm a renter, but I'm a white renter that was born in this country. I'm never going to experience any of these things. I wouldn't know about these things unless you yourself and other migrants speak on it. So I really do appreciate taking the time and felt the emotional toll that it's included in discussing these things. And I do also emphasize as well that as an organisation, Generation Rent, we are very keen to, as well as add spat about the rights and tell people about the rights people have, also to campaign on discrimination and for migrants specifically. And I can talk about that a bit later at the end. So there is very much a route through and a way of improving the situation, not only through us, but also obviously through Sun's work with the organisations that you've worked with. But it is extremely tough and very difficult. Okay, well, next up, we've got our speaker Sam, who's going to be talking about some of the more practical, I suppose, side of the thing, which is the sort of like, these are the rights that we do have, and that talking through exactly how we can go about using them to improve things. So, Sam, over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to talk about the legal barriers. So that's particularly the face migrants only. So kind of Son, that was a useful reminder that even if there weren't kind of any legal barriers to accessing housing, which of course there are for migrants, then you'd have all these other kind of barriers in the way. So kind of some of them might be kind of overt racism, and some of them might be just you're disadvantaged because, like you mentioned, credit checks and stuff. You haven't got a credit history yet, and so either that gives either the landlords, kind of not overtly racist, but not willing to let to you because you're seen as a higher risk, or it can be used as an excuse. So what I'm going to talk about are the rules. Let's remember that these are pre-qualifying rules that other people, people with British citizens who generally don't face these barriers. So on top of everything that you've said, you've also got these other things on top. I'm not going to talk about actual rights in terms of in the property itself. So, kind of enforcing repairs and that kind of stuff. But we can probably cover that over in the questions when we get to that. So just trying to move my presentation on, trying to work out how to do that, and it's not doing what I want. Oh, right. Okay. So this information, everything I'm going to talk to, you can find out. So these pre-qualifying rights, you can find out on our housing rights information site. This is from the Chartered Institute of Housing, and it covers all jurisdictions in the UK. So the laws are sometimes slightly different in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. I'm going to talk about the English stuff. Generally, that will be applicable in all the other countries as well, except for the right to rent, which is at the moment England only. But if you want to check out some of this stuff yourself, the site's split into two halves. So one for new arrivals. So that's you. That's a little bit more simplified. And then if you're an advisor, then you've got things like case law to kind of back that up as well, if you want to go into a bit more detail. Right. Okay. So some general stuff about immigration laws and how they affect access to housing. I'm going to cover three main areas about housing, migrants' housing rights in the presentation, and those are going to be in relation to the right to rent that Son already mentioned. So that's the right to get a private tenancy, access to social housing, and how and when you can apply for that, and then help with rent if you've got a low income through benefits. And all of these have barriers of fairly similar ones, but kind of slightly different for each one. And these are based on immigration control. So immigration control, the main area of law is the Immigration Act, and that's the act that says that you need a visa to enter the UK if you're not a UK national. That's anybody who doesn't have the right to abode. Now, that's a technical term, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But for most part, it means anyone who's not a British citizen. And if you don't have the right to abode, you require permission to enter the country. This is called leave, and you'll have all gone through that process to get into the UK. And that immigration control itself is linked to access to homelessness and local authority housing. If you're homeless, so going to the local authority if you're homeless to try and get rehoused or assistance from the local authority. And anybody who's subject to immigration control, in other words, if you require leave to enter the UK, then you're disqualified. And for benefits and rented housing, it's a slightly lower barrier. And basically means if you don't have leave, then you're going to be excluded, or if you have leave and it's got a no public funds condition attached. Okay, leaves granted by immigration officers, and they follow things which are called the immigration rules, which are sort of law. They have the force of law, but they're slightly different to other areas of law. And the Home Secretary also has discretion, so you might sometimes hear leave outside the rules. That's what that means. It's just a government, the Home Secretary granting permission at their discretion. And there are different types of leave. You'll probably come across one of these because it will apply to you. Leave can be open-ended, which is indefinite leave, or for a fixed period. And if it's for a fixed period, it's called limited leave, and it's often for 30 months. So blocks of 2.5 years. And it can be granted with or without conditions, and with or without a sponsor. Conditions are the most typical one you come across is no public funds, which then excludes you from access to homelessness and benefits. Sometimes if you're excluded, you can apply to the Home Office to get your exclusion lifted. So if you've got a no public funds condition, sometimes you can apply to have that changed. But if you're considering doing that, for example, because you need access to benefits because you've lost employment, always get immigration advice first, because even if you're it doesn't affect your status now, it may affect your status at the end of, if you've got limited leave, you might not be granted leave again when that comes to an end. So you should always get good immigration advice first. So there's a link to a Home Office website which will send you contact details of regulated immigration advisors. So I mentioned a right of abode. That basically means anybody who's a British citizen, and certain Commonwealth citizens who arrived here before 1973, and in some cases their children as well. So you may well have heard of the Windrush scandal. This is basically, so before the Immigration Act 1971 came into force, people who were from UK Commonwealth countries, British Commonwealth countries could enter the UK without they could get leave without any problems. And when that changed, there were certain people who'd already arrived under those rules were allowed to stay here. The problem was they didn't have any documentary proof of that, and that's where the Windrush scandal came in. And then everybody else requires leave to enter in the UK, except Irish citizens, who are assumed to have leave in most cases. So unless you've done something really drastically wrong. So you've kind of got this hierarchy of status in terms of access to those three types of basic housing rights. So right at the top, British citizen, they're generally not excluded, although everybody has to prove that they're habitually resident if you're accessing benefits. So a British citizen who has lived abroad and enters the UK again for the first time after living abroad, they can't access benefits immediately. And then other people with the right of abode, so that's basically those Windrush people, and then Irish citizens. So the further down you fall on this list, then the more kind of problems that you're going to encounter. If you're kind of below 6, then that's where the real problems start, and you might end up being destitute. And in all of those cases, I would always say, before you pursue your housing rights, get your immigration status checked and get immigration advice first before you do anything about any of the others. And there's a hierarchy on the access to services as well. So the public service, where the levels, those levels of immigration status have the highest hurdle for you to go over, is homelessness, and then slightly below that, social security benefits. So they're slightly easier to get in most cases, and then to get a private tenancy, and then access to social care. So in these cases, so assuming you didn't have any of the above, you might still be able to get access to social care if you're disabled or you've got children. And then below that, I'm not going to talk about those other ones because they are really tied to immigration status, but they basically people who've been refused leave or claimed asylum and refused asylum and are still here. So I'm going to talk about the right to rent. So this is the main this is the main right that you've in England, barrier that you need to come to just to get an ordinary private tenancy. That's part of what's called the hostile environment. So that's been rebranded now by the Home Office as the compliant environment to make it sound nicer, but basically it just means exactly the same thing. So they've just done a rebranding exercise which followed the Windrush scandal, and that's not just about access to housing. The idea is to deprive undocumented migrants, so people without leave, access to essential services, so it makes it very difficult for people to stay here, or if they do, then they're likely to be fined out when they if they apply for any of these things. So driving license, renting a home, access to the NHS and welfare benefits. And so anybody it applies to actually applies to the landlord. So the landlords are responsible for doing checks. And that would include you if you're a tenant, and then you take in lodgers. So you also have to carry out checks on your lodgers. So yeah, that's basically what the right to rent is. So the landlord's required to make some checks, and if they don't do that, then they become liable, both criminally and for a fine. I think the fines are quite heavy now. I think they start at, if I remember rightly, I think it's £10,000 for the first breach. So they've got to do document checks and repeat checks on people whose rights to rent are time limited. So that basically, somebody has a time limited right to rent. That's one that runs with your leave. So if you've got indefinite leave, you have got a right to rent, and it's for an indefinite period. You just got to prove it. If you've got limited leave, then your right to rent only runs as long as your leave period, and after that, the landlord is required to make some repeat checks. Yeah, and I've said that already. Criminal offences for landlords who don't comply, and serious heavy fines. So the right to rent applies to all adults who are going to be living in the property, not just the people who are going to sign up to the contract and get the tenancy. So the landlord's only defence is that they've made reasonable inquiries about the occupiers beforehand. So these people who aren't on the tenancy, they might then have a defence to that. So how does it work? Well, you've probably come across this, experienced this already. I'm going to talk about the proof, because that's changed over the last few years quite a bit from when the right to rent came in. So as I've said, landlords have to check documents and ask for proof. Originally, landlords could do that through a physical document check. So ask to see your passport, see the required documents that would prove the right to rent, and they had various other ways of doing it as well. And then they'd have to do the repeat checks when the leave came to an end. And I've talked about that already. So yeah, you repeat checks either after 1 year, or if your leave period is going to end within that year, then 28 days before it expires, the landlord will need to do a check. So you don't need a right to rent. rent, or in other words, you have got a right to rent automatically if you're a British citizen, an Irish citizen, or an EU citizen who's applied to the EU settlement scheme and you've been granted either settled status or pre-settled status. You might have applied for either of those and not got a decision yet, although you should have done by now. But you don't need it. You've got a right to rent, but you've still got to prove that. So that's where you need your documentation to prove that you do have a right to rent. So even British citizens have to prove that. So proving that you're exempt, in other words, proving that you do have a right to rent. Obviously, if you're British, you're not going to have, and probably if you're Irish as well, you're not going to have Home Office documents saying granting you leave, because you can just enter. Well, if you're British, you don't need to enter anyway. So you prove that by physical documents. So that will be a passport or certain other documents if you're British or Irish, because you might not have a passport. You know, a lot of people, particularly on low incomes, don't have passports. But if you're an EU national who's gone through the or family member of a EU national who's gone through the EU settlement scheme, you've got to the only way that you can prove that is to get an online share code. And the links are there for that. You get a code which lasts for 90 days. You can use it as many times as you want to. Once you've got a share code, you can then tell your landlord about that, and then they can just go online and check that. So the link's there for the landlord to do that. If you ever get a skeptical landlord, is a bit worried, thinks it might be a bit of a hassle, it should be pretty quick once you've got your online share code, and it shouldn't take you long to get that one anyway if you've got that status. So anybody else who doesn't have the right to, who isn't exempt, must have a right to rent, and that essentially means that you've got to have leave, and the way that you prove that to your landlord will depend on how you entered the UK, but most of that is electronic now, and you can't normally do it through a physical document check. So you have to use that online service that I talked about if you're an EU national. You also have to use it if you use the ID app when you applied for your visa. You also have to use it if you created a visa account, an online account with the Home Office, or you applied for an e-visa, or if you entered the UK using an automated passport gate. So EU nationals, EU citizens can enter the UK. So people who didn't enter the UK, weren't in the UK before we left the EU and are entering the UK for the first time now. If you're EU, you can go through a automated passport gate. The only way that you can prove your right to rent is through getting a share code. And most other people who have at some point been given physical documents or got some other form of documentation that's not one of those, they're being contacted by the Home Office since April of this year, and they're going to change this system over, so everybody will go through this online, except for people who've only just entered the UK and have applied to the Home Office. So, you know, when you first applied for your visa, you had to send your documents off to the Home Office, and for that period of, you know, however many months it was, you didn't have any documents. So obviously you've got a right to rent there at that point. It's called a discretionary right to rent. And the way that you do that is through the landlord checking service. So you just give your landlord your Home Office reference number and your name, and then your landlord can apply online, and they should get a response within 2 working days. And if they don't, then you can go ahead and got the right to rent anyway. So, but most of you, the point is now, most of you are going to be through this online system, and that's the only way that you can prove those things. Okay, so going on to allocations and homelessness now. So
just very quickly, Sam, sorry.
Yeah.
Just give you a 5-minute warning, basically. And then just if you could.
Yeah, okay.
Through the rest
So allocation, so that's getting a social tenancy. You've got to be not subject to immigration control, and certain people are allowed who are subject to immigration control are exempted from that rule or passported through that rule, and you have to prove that you're also, in most cases, habitually resident in the UK. So this is to get access to homelessness, to allocations and homelessness. So in most cases, if you're an EU or an EU worker with pre-settled status, if you've got EU settled status or you've got EU pre-settled status, then you're, in most cases, you will be okay there. And these are those eligible classes which cover certain types of immigrants. So these are people who are subject to immigration control. You might fall into one of those lists there. You've probably heard about Ukrainians being given access to housing, so they fall into one of those lists. That's not an exhaustive list, but those are the most common ones you might come across. If the rules become quite a bit more complicated if you're from a mixed eligible household. So if, let's say, you're eligible because you've got leave, you've got indefinite leave, you've got settled status, but you've got other people in your family who are still not got full status yet, then you may be able to apply for homelessness services, but you still might not get them because your priority, particularly if your priority depends on them. So to get access to homelessness services, for example, you'll get priority if you've got a child. So if the child you've got status, but your child has only got a lower form of status, then essentially what happens is they're kind of ignored, and then you get your rights are essentially diminished. And then finally, getting access to benefits. As I said, these are a little bit free. You must be not subject to immigration control, but that means a slightly different thing. So basically means anybody who doesn't have leave or has leave but with a no public funds condition, most other people can get access, unless you're also a sponsored immigrant. So if somebody you got permission to come here because somebody's agreed to fund your accommodation or your living expenses, and you've got to be habitually resident. That basically means you've made your home here. That's that rule that I talked about, which applies to everybody. So including British citizens. So it essentially bars you from getting immediate access on arrival to the UK, even if you've been given leave of an appropriate sort. But that exclusion only usually lasts for 1 to 3 months. And then there are certain exemptions to that. I can talk about those. And then the rules again are a bit more complicated if you're part of a couple on benefits. So for universal credit, which is the basic working age benefit, if only one of you is eligible, you can claim that universal credit as a single person. But I would still, and that won't count as public funds, so it shouldn't affect your immigration status. But my advice would be don't do that before getting immigration advice. So although you won't be breaking the terms of your leave, it may affect the renewal when it comes up. And there are similar rules for housing benefit as well. They're slightly different. I'm not going to cover those. I've made the rather bold assumption that most of you here are under 66. So that's the benefit that you claim for help with your rent if you're pension age or over. In any other case, it's universal credit. So I'm not going to go through those. And I'm not going to go through the habitual residence test. If people have had problems with that, we can perhaps talk about that in questions. I don't know why it did that funny order there. I've made some balls up on the slides when I put them together. Okay, right. So that was quite a lot to get through. I'm sorry I didn't have time to cover other rights as well, but as Tilly said, as I suggested, you may want to talk about those in the questions. I'm sure you've got some questions already for either me or Son.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sam. Sorry I had to rush. I know there's a lot to get through, and you can probably deliver an entire year of information and still would get through all the stuff that's useful. So I do appreciate there's a lot. Okay, so we have 15 minutes or thereabouts for a Q&A section, question answer session. So if you do have any questions, please do put them in the Q&A function rather than the chat function, so we can see them fielded to the same place.
Well, I'll put my slides back on again because I might want to refer to those if people have got when they do have questions. Yeah. Okay.
I think I would like to start with a question of my own. It's not my own question, but it's from what we've heard from people. So I'll put it to the group. So we are aware that there are going to be changes to the immigration system coming up, where the physical documents aren't going to be sort of valid anymore, and you're going to be needing some purely online documents to prove your right to rent. I wondered if either of you two, or both of you two, could give us a bit more information really about that and how that's going to be changing, especially with proving your right to rent.
Yeah, well, you'll basically, it will mean everybody will have to go through the share code basis, so you'll have to get your share code. What's happening if you've still got a physical document, or if you've got you proved it through some other way over the course of, starting from April of this year, Home Office have been emailing people and inviting them to open an e-account or get an e-visa. Once you've done that, there's no going backwards. So you will be in that system of having to use the online share code. If that's, for some people, for a lot of people, that won't be problematic. You've got your leave, so it shouldn't be a problem. It's basically going to be much more difficult now for people to who haven't got leave or who are in the process of getting it. If you're in the process of getting it, then you go through the landlord checking service site, as I said before, but that will mainly only apply now to people as they're entering the UK and being given permission to apply for leave. In every other case, it's going to be through the online online checking service. I don't know whether anybody here has received an email from the Home Office yet inviting them to.
Can I hop in?
Sorry?
Can I hop in? So yeah, it
Yeah.
is the 31st of December 2024 that all physical documents that currently proves people's ability to live in the country lawfully, as horrible as the idea of lawful living is, and right to rent and all of that, expires on the 31st of December 2024. And everyone needs to switch to an e-visa system from the 1st of January. Now, I think specifically what this means, though, for migrant communities is one, if you are a migrant, and many migrants are, who come from countries where using smartphones is not a common thing, or where you've not been, because of the education system there, whether that's through wars or through lack of investment, you've never had access to education and you're not able to read. This system that depends on people's ability to navigate an online portal is exclusionary and discriminatory, right? Now, it excludes older British people as well, but it particularly affects migrant communities that perhaps do not speak English very well, or do not, for whatever reason, are not able to read. So yeah, I think this
It's going to affect the Windrush people again as well, isn't it? So
yeah, in practice, right? I think the other thing too, though, is that yes, and Sam, you're right. Landlords are meant to be using this online system. In practice, though, I have had landlords that didn't really get it and still wanted a physical card that just said, leave to remain.
yes,
All
yeah,
of these
I'm sure that's
landlords that
right.
will not understand this new visa system. What will they think when all that us migrants have is this share code? Question mark.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you're right about that. There's something a bit more comforting about a physical document like a passport, and I can perfectly understand a landlord feeling more comfortable having seeing somebody's passport and it assuming that it's the Home Office line on this is that, oh well, obviously there are fake passports sometimes and landlords couldn't didn't have the ability to properly distinguish between the different types of document. But I can perfectly understand that some landlords may feel more reassured about this than going through an online system, and particularly as it's online scams aren't that unusual, whether in banking or any other kind of area. So you could understand a landlord being a bit skeptical about whether you give them a genuine share code and something comes back from the Home Office, whether that is actual proof or reassurance for them. So I'm sure that probably will crop up every now and again as an issue.
Thank you both. We haven't had any questions through today, so we're hoping that means that the presentations have covered everyone's issues. But another another issue that comes up quite a lot with people that we speak to is how to prove your rent, kind of what the sort of deal is, or as much as a layperson can. But what people struggle with is getting landlords to kind of accept the right to rent, accept the proof as right to rent. So I wondered if either of you had some sort of top tips on basically convincing landlords that the idea of the rent, or sort of ways of getting that across to them.
Well, I mean, I think the main way would be, so I've put two links in there that the landlords have got a choice. Either they can do the share code, and I've given the two. I'll just see if I can go back on my slides. I've given the two links on there. All right. So on the one slide, there was, I'm trying to go back, but it's not letting me. On the one slide, there was one which is about how you get your share code, and there was a link there to that. and then you then tell your landlord to go in and you know, to check it through that, and there's a page for landlords to do that. So it might help reassure the landlord if they go to that page, they can read about it there, or they can do the landlord checking service. So that's a series of questions that the landlord does, and it's a secure portal, and it looks like a secure portal. So if they prefer to do something closer to a physical check, then they can, you know, even though it's an online thing, it takes them through step by step the questions that they must ask and what they need to get. And as I say, that should be fairly quick as well. So you should get an answer within 48 hours from the landlord having made an inquiry, because I know that's a problem as well, isn't it, in terms of getting a tenancy. So, you know, if you're in the queue and or there's you know, there's a lot of people behind you all likely to chase this property, and the landlord's oh blimey, I've got to do a check. Some, you know, although they should be making checks on everybody, even if they're British, they may be inclined not to do that and be doing it on, well, you know, kind of things which basically are discriminatory by, you know, assuming that people are, you know, what their status is, or so you can. One of the things that might put what I was trying to get to say was that one of the things that might put a landlord off and go for the apparently easier option would be to, you know, just go for somebody who they think probably doesn't need a check. But you can reassure them that these things that, you know, are fairly are fairly quick. And in fact, if you go through the landlord checking service and they don't give you a reply within 48 hours, the landlord's covered. So they can go ahead and let to you anyway, even if you don't have the right status. That's they're protected for that. So it is fairly checked. So you get quick. So you should be able to, in most cases, you should be able to persuade the landlord that, you know, it's no less hassle. And in fact, they can, you know, they can get fined for not checking a British person, even if they're completely convinced that they're British. They still need to have done the check. So the landlord checking service applies to any kind of status. So that would include British people as well, because obviously they don't have immigration documents.
Great, thank you. I didn't know that about being covered even when the Home Office doesn't get back to you. So that's useful to know.
Yeah, that's actually in the regulations. So yeah.
Excellent. Well, we're sort of running up close to our time. I don't see any further questions in the Q&A, so I'm hoping that means that this has been so comprehensive that no one has any further questions. Obviously, if you do have some further questions, would look into things, we will be sending around an email tomorrow, I hope, to send any and all questions there. We have I just have a last minute question from someone, which has popped up and then disappeared on my screen. So there we go. Someone has asked, what kind of checks are landlords conducting? So I think that means specifically, what are they sort of looking for when proving a right to rent?
Well, they've either basically got to check one of two things: either that you're exempt, so that means you're British or you're Irish, or you're an EU person who's gone through the EU settlement scheme. but they still have to check that. If not, basically they're looking for whether you've got leave, which might be indefinite leave, limited leave, or if you've applied for leave, in which case you get what's called a discretionary right to rent. But that has to be confirmed through the Home Office, which you do through one of those, usually through the landlord checking service. So that's what they're looking for. If there was a situation whereby you didn't have leave, or your leave had expired or whatever, if the landlord's done the checks, then they're covered. They don't have to offer you a tenancy, and they don't have to pass that information on to the Home Office. But obviously, if they go through a check, then with an online system, Home Office is going to have that information anyway. But so, you know, if you're ever in that situation where you don't have leave and the landlord's asking for it, then your best situation is to say, okay, I'll walk away.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so
And
much.
obviously go and get immigration advice, because that's the thing that's most important from a regulated advisor.
Excellent, thank you. Well, it is 7 o'clock, which is time on our webinar. So as I said previously, we'll be sharing around all of the resources mentioned, as well as the presentations. I'll also share a link to our Generation Rents campaign on housing equality, which is specifically around migrant and ethnic minority communities. I'll share Sun's new campaign organisation that I've forgotten the name of, rather poorly as a chair.
Actual change.
Actual change. So I'll send a link around to that as well, which is all around migrant rights, and in particular documentation and things like that. Is it a fair summary, Son?
Oh wait, oh, you're talking about the other thing, e-visa campaign. I will follow up with that separate.
Okay.
But yeah,
all right.
Yeah.
Well, excellent. I think we have ended almost on time, just 1 minute. 1 minute over. And thank you so much, everyone, for coming here in the evening. You're giving up some of your evening to be here. Very much appreciate it. Hopefully that was handy for you. And you'll be shortly receiving an email from us. But for tonight, it's goodbye from Tilly, and goodbye from Sam, and goodbye